Thank you all for coming. Welcome. I'm Linda Miles from UK Trade and Investment, based out of the British Consulate in Perth in Western Australia. So it's lovely to see you all today. Firstly, I thought I'd start off with just a quick map that shows you that Australia is very big. Western Europe quite nicely fits inside the map of Australia there. To put it into perspective, to fly from London to Moscow is the same flying time as to fly from Perth to Sydney. So it's about 4,000 kilometres. So we do say to companies that are interested in Australia, do be aware that if you land in Perth, we're not going to be able to organise an afternoon meeting in Melbourne, because you do require to build into that the flight time. We are very much in the same time zone as Asia, and that's where we tend to position ourselves. So if you do work with Southeast Asia, do consider Australia as well. Over half the population live in Asia, so mostly in China and India, and especially in Western Australia, we are in the same time zone. So it's very easy to do business out of Perth and out of Sydney with China, India and Southeast Asia. We feel very connected to that part of the world. A little snapshot of the two countries. We are very similar in many ways. Apart from population and landmass, where Australia very much wins that battle, GDP is similar, ease of doing business is very similar, GDP growth is very similar. Even the unemployment figure in July was exactly the same. So apart from the fact that we have the same language, the same very similar taxation systems, ways of doing business, it is quite an easy place to work. So on to opportunities in waste. Today I'm going to talk about the increasing cost of waste, developments in the waste to energy sector, hazardous waste, and wastewater management. So if we start with the increasing cost of waste. Australia is actually one of the highest producers of municipal waste in the world, with 52 million tonnes of waste generated per year, and 25 million tonnes of this goes into landfill. So the fact that 95% of that 25 million tonnes is able to be renewed is quite significant. The generation of waste is growing at a faster rate than the population rise. So with the landfill capacity diminishing, the local governments have been raising their landfill levies. Currently, the levy is about $12 to $60 per tonne, depending on which local council. But that will rise to over 105 Australian dollars by 2018. So that's quite a significant cost factor that will drive change. Change is being driven from local governments. They continue to outsource their waste management to private companies. There are over 500 councils in Australia. I believe it's fairly similar in the UK. There are lots of smaller councils. For example, in Western Australia alone, there are 180 councils. So to try and get them to work together, the operators do have to deal with each council individually. So they try and herd some together to generate enough waste for their operations. On the whole, though, recycled waste is becoming more of a financially viable sector. $2.8 billion worth of revenue for the recycling industry, and on top of that there are the environmental benefits and the benefits from voters and their expectations. Okay, so moving on to waste to energy. This is a state issue in Australia. Over in the east they call it energy from waste, in the west we call it waste to energy, so bear with me if I call it something different. The policies are not consistent across the country, so there are challenges for operators. For example, in New South Wales and Victoria, there is an official waste to energy policy. In the West, there is strong planning and environmental support, So the agencies do collaborate, but there's no specific policy yet in place. In Queensland and the Australian Capital Territory, they are developing their policy. I heard this morning from a company that they are also in South Australia, although no formal policy has yet been decided on. The Waste Management Association of Australia has held their Waste Symposium last year in 2014, and they wanted to show that there is a huge amount of ideas and expertise and collaboration already happening. So they called for a shared responsibility for developing the infrastructure across all of the states, so engaging the support of the community and remove the barriers that are currently in place. The symposium is developing a framework, so hopefully industry will take part in that and show that there are true benefits in the energy from waste sector. Okay, the main players in Australia, and I'd like to thank MRA Consulting Group who provided me with this slide. It just shows the operations that are in place in the waste to energy sector, both mechanical, biological treatment and thermal treatment. The big players are there, so you've got Semcita, Visi, Anaco, you might have heard of. So they are well and truly established in Australia already, but UK companies have won contracts to work with these companies in waste to energy plants. Private industry tends to be driving the change, although watch this space because you may have seen overnight that there's a new Prime Minister in Australia in the last day. So the new Prime Minister is a lot more environmentally friendly, shall we say, so he will hopefully start driving a bit of change in that space. Anaerobic digestion hasn't been a complete commercial success in Australia, possibly because of the type of waste that was used. I'm not too sure if that had something to do with it, but the pyrolysis method tends to be a preferred method of waste to energy technology. So that's just showing away from the map the type of treatments that are existing and the main companies that are working in that space. There are two plants going in the west by New Energy, which is an Australian company, and their plant will use the gasification method. So that's going on in the northwest, and that will help power a lot of the town of Karratha in the northwest. Now, hazardous waste is heavily scrutinised by the EPAs, the Environmental Protection Agencies in Australia. There is no levy on hazardous waste, so that avoids illegal dumping. But the councils tend to outsource their hazardous waste collection services because this reduces their risk of fines and therefore bad publicity, damaged reputation, etc. A lot of them find that it's more cost effective to hire an outside company to do their haulage. So the waste collection side of the sector is very much growing. There's a high demand for hauling services as these industries are growing. Healthcare, construction, manufacturing and hospitality sectors, all of those sectors have very much grown in the last few years. So the main areas of hazardous waste collection in Australia would be asbestos removal. You probably know that there's a lot of asbestos from the Wittenoom mine up in the northwest that was closed down many years ago. So there's still asbestos all around. So asbestos removal is a big sector for the industry. Medical waste, contaminated soil and toxic chemicals. There's a massive mining industry, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the toxic waste side of things is quite strong there. Major players again, Semcita, Veolia, Trans-Pacific Industries, which is an Australian-based company. But having said that, they make up about 40% of the industry, so there is room for the smaller companies who specialise in hazardous waste collection. The government regulations actually benefit this sector because it means that only licensed companies are permitted to remove and haul waste. Australia actually suffered the deepest and most protracted drought in history, which went from the late 1990s through the early 2000s. And that was known as the Millennium Drought. So with the increase in the population and the lack of rainfall, it meant that the state and the federal government had to consider other sources of water supply, apart from the traditional method of dams, because the levels were dropping so much. So they focused on techniques for recovering usable water from saltwater, wastewater and stormwater. So there were desalination plants, wastewater plants, and the groundwater replenishment schemes were put into play. Mostly they were joint investments between local or state governments rather and private industry. The drought's now eased, so growth in new infrastructure has slowed, but the population is driving a lot of the change. So we would say that sewage treatment facilities and the like should continue to increase. I mentioned the mining industry earlier. This is a $212 billion industry in Australia, and iron ore makes up nearly half of that industry. The main issue to do with wastewater is what to do with the excess water after dewatering. So quite often this is returned to the water supply, or it's used in industrial processes and agriculture. A lot of the big mining companies like Rio Tinto, they do have farms out near their mining sites, and they use that produce and sell it on. If the water is salty, or more often it's quite brackish, then they might put in a desalination plant, and then they can use that water for potable water. The National Centre for Groundwater is working with the mining sector in Australia, and they're researching the movement of water once it's discharged and how that influences the groundwater and other ecosystems. These findings will be applied to mining, both underground and open cut operations. So mine operators are looking to avoid any implication, any impact on the environment. Okay, so what can UKTI Australia do for you? We have various teams across the country, but in the West, in the Perth office, we cover the environment sector as well as mining, oil and gas, power, water, so any of the natural resource type sectors. So a lot of our work is about connecting people in the UK with people in Australia. We can provide up-to-date market reports, so if you want a bit of further in-depth information that's relevant to you. And we also can assist with designing a meeting program. So the time difference is a bit of an issue. Sometimes it's 7 hours behind, sometimes it's up to 11 hours behind here. So we can be the person who rings around and creates your meetings for you. The webinar system was produced by UKTI in the last year or two. These normally happen at 9 o'clock in the morning, so we're at the end of our day, and they are specific to each sector across Australia. So I believe the webinar program is on the UKTI website. Our team in Sydney, they run a PR service, so if you'd like a bit of local promotion through local media, or like your business promoted in our UKTI e-newsletters that go out across Australia and through UKTI, then they can provide that for you. And they also assist with social media campaigns, so through LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. We also do many other things, but that's just the main bulk of the work that we do with connecting businesses.